Okay. Oh, it's even working now. Hi, everyone. I'm Robin King from the World Resources Institute, the Center for Sustainable Cities. And my voice is like, and I will be moderating the panel, sort of our last panel. If you can hold on through this last panel, afterwards there is a cocktail party. And so you will be rewarded with food and beverages of your choice. So we have a stimulating panel to talk about various things connected to cities and climate change mitigation. Before we get to the panel, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the broader challenges that we face linked to not so much even just the specific topics, but just the nature of the discussion in this conference, which is to bring economists and policymakers together, which means that we want to do solid evidence-based work, but we want to make sure that policymakers understand it and that they can use it. And so at the World Resources Institute, we work a lot on the policy side, and frankly, we have a huge challenge in translating some of the more analytical work sort of for policymakers. So much of what we try to do is sort of bring together evidence and sort of package it in different kinds of ways. So we write big reports like this, right? This is 7 transformations for more equitable and sustainable cities. It's like 200 pages. It's got evidence from many papers. It was the culmination of a series of 16 different papers that we wrote over 6 years with policymakers and academics across the Global South. But very few people are going to actually read this, right? So from this, we go to an executive summary that maybe is, 35 pages? And even that, the policymakers think is too long. So we try to pull out things that are even shorter so that they can understand and get the insights from research, but then apply them sort of in a way that makes sense sort of in their policy setting. So these things are available at citiesforall.org. I'm happy to talk to you about it afterwards. But the session today, or this last session, is going to start with a mini keynote by Dr. Siqi Zheng, who is the STL Champion Professor of Urban and Real Estate Sustainability at the Center for Real Estate and Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. She also is the founding director and for the MIT Center for Real Estate, and I could go on and on and on about other things, but we're going to give her time to present her presentation, and then afterwards we'll have 2 additional papers presented and a discussant. So,
thank you, Robbie. Okay, so it's my honor to be here and share my recent thoughts and ongoing projects on this area, decarbonizing the building sector. So I'm going to look into 2 different perspectives and how to marry them together. One is engineering thinking, and the other is economic thinking. So I was trained as a civil engineer when I got into college, and then later I didn't know why I went to study policy and economics. So that's why I felt very comfortable to talk about buildings. And that's why I also asked Remy your question about basement, and because these are structural things and the building, the engineering thinking, I think that's very, very familiar to me. And also, I think it's also important because sometimes the engineers, they are over-optimistic about some technologies that can solve these climate change issues. But sometimes they are over-pessimistic because they saw although the technology is so good, so great, but the adoption is very difficult. The adoption of those technologies is so slow. So it's like always, sometimes very over-optimistic, and then later became so pessimistic. But how we can work together to create incentives, not just the technology itself, but also incentives to accelerate the adoption, or we see make this technology more targeted at some subpopulation groups and some locations. So that's basically my talk. I will mainly talk about 2 technologies, not go into the deep of these technological details, but how to understand how this mismatch and how to understand the incentives and also the trade-offs of these market decision makers, and how to create like a policy, those incentives. So we all know that just now we had a session on adaptation. Now this session is about mitigation. So this building decarbonization basically is mitigation. And as we all know that buildings, they contribute more than one third of the energy use and the 40% of the carbon emission. Of course, we need to count both embodied carbon of the construction itself and then the operational carbon altogether. And that's why we are always the target of this policy regulation. So it's all over the world. So this is some headlines of newspaper articles. That's a policy pressure to decarbonize all over the world, every country, from the United States to Europe and Australia and Asia. So especially cities, they always say they have the pledge, say 2040 or 2050, my city will become net zero. So how to get net zero? The building sector is a big thing. We must decarbonize this sector. How to decarbonize? Put pressure on the owners of the current buildings to renovate, to retrofit the buildings, and then this is about the Europe Green Deal. They have the renovation wave. They have a lot of funding, and they subsidize all these renovations to achieve the 2040 all new and existing buildings net zero. So that's one example of the huge investment in this sector. And we know this, another example is about New York City here. And they have the local law 97. That's a very, very big example of this very stringent net zero policy on buildings. They target relatively big buildings right now, but later maybe they will expand to smaller sized buildings. But now it's big buildings larger than 25,000 square feet. And then they say they have the cap. This is a carbon tax. They have the cap by 2030, 2024, 2030, 2040 and 2050. So they set the cap of the carbon emission per square feet. And if you cannot meet that, you have to pay the penalty for emissions above the cap, which is $268 per year per metric ton of the CO2 above that cap. So that basically all the buildings, as you can see, only 20% of the current buildings, they meet this criteria of 2024. And then later will be more and more buildings will be below that. So there is a lot of pressure, then they need to take action. They have a carbon emission calculator to show. You can just go into this website, you put the building's address in this, they will immediately calculate if you do nothing, and then 2030 to 2034, then you need to pay this amount of penalty, and then later we'll pay this amount of penalty. So then this basically changed the pro forma of the buildings, and then when the building owners, they need to make a decision whether to retrofit or it's a light retrofit or deep retrofit. They need to consider this penalty as a cash flow, and then they do all the calculations, but not just only the penalty, because this is a signal, and then later the market preference will change. If you don't do anything, the tenants will leave your building. Maybe you have to experience a higher vacancy rate and a decline of the rent. So actually, this New York City Local Law 97 is very famous, but actually Boston's version of this is more stringent, because Boston's version of the Berthold 2.0 is a similar thing, but it is very clear 2050 must be net zero. But for Local Law 97, actually it's not net zero in 2025. And the penalty, the dollar value also larger than the New York City. So that's we see from Boston and New York City. But on the other side, you will see some states, because the key thing, the only pathway to net zero will be electrification, to change all from gas to electricity. And then for other states, they said, no, you cannot do that. You cannot force. And they passed new laws to block those cities who want to curb the natural gas. It's become a political battle on this, and that totally is very related to the political preference of the government and at the different levels. So that's about United States. As you can see, it's a progressive, and some other places are not. And now I look at China, and actually we are building up a global tracker of those policies. I just give you 2 examples, but global tracker for different countries, different cities, this kind of policy, you will see a big variation. So in China's case, it's totally different from here. It's very top-down, and the central government, the CCP, will see a target. It's very, 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 very ambitious and aspirational. And they will say a very ambitious target, but they only have like relatively aspirational ways to achieve that. And it's not sometimes not very practical. And some of the very top down, they shut down factories, they lay off workers. Then they also receive pushback, especially when the economy is in a recession. So it's like cycles. And in good times, they are very ambitious. In bad times, they revert. And they reopen the factory, they forgot their pledges. So that's also another problem of this net zero regulation. So given this, there will be some political economy interesting stories to look into that. And then let's think about technology side. So for the technology side, to understand a building, go back to my civil engineering background, and you need to understand the building's carbon footprint from the very beginning. Then there's a lot of embodied carbon because you need the steel, the concrete to build a building and the construction process. And then when the building is up, it's operational carbon. So, and then you have the end of the life cycle. So now, for the net zero, all the cities, they only look at the operational carbon. They have not get the chance to look at the embodied carbon. So embodied carbon means more like greener materials or the circularity in the construction. But now it's when those cities, New York City and Boston, they are looking at the operational carbon. So if we only look at operational carbon, what are the strategies that to mitigate all this building decarbonization? Always we say 3 steps. So first, you use less energy. First, you use less. That means improve energy efficiency. So here I have a small thing, and later I will dive into this. It's a technology called a passive house. It's from Germany, and it's like very, very efficient. Highlight the energy conservation using very high level of the very sophisticated insulation. And that passive house technology, you use less. And then after you use less, you still are using energy. You cannot be zero. Then you switch to renewable energies, either on-site or off-site. On-site uses the solar panels. And off-site, you can buy some like a wind farm, solar farm somewhere. And also electrify your buildings from gas-based heating, especially the New England area, heating is more important, and gas-based heating to electricity-based heating. That's a heat pump technology. So I will look at this passive house insulation technology and the heat pump technology. And finally, even if you have done all the things, still cannot get to zero, but you have to get zero, then you purchase carbon offsets. But that have a lot of critiques on carbon offset. I'm not going to go to that. The first technology is passive house from Germany. And at first, like 5 years ago, this technology was very new. And now it's more and more adoption, And some architects and civil engineers and also the developers are more and more familiar with this. So this is mainly the idea is just insulation. And of course, you cannot just, people, they don't want to live in a plastic bag. Plastic bag is very good, like totally insulated, but you feel so, you cannot breathe. So they highlight the insulation, but at the same time also improve air quality, indoor air quality, have the ventilation. So that's an idea. And then basically that's, you can see that there always this technology is applied to multifamily houses, more multi-family houses than single family, and then other types. Why? Because they really need a big chunk of wall. They need wall because the wall, they don't want many windows. Smaller windows and the bigger walls. So that it's better to do the insulation. And multifamily, you know, those units, they share walls. So they have less external walls. They have more internal walls. That's easier for insulation. And then the additional cost, basic on engineering estimate about 3% to 10%. And this is all the benefits of this: energy saving, health, comfort, and resilience, etc. So think about this. So basically, as I said, in Massachusetts right now, I'm looking at Massachusetts, it's more than 100 multifamily housing projects. They have been adopting this passive house. But this is the first one. That is an office building. So office building hard, because office building, as you know, the tenants, these big companies, they want very big windows, for example. And for this one, it's the first big office building that use passive house. So this is just still under construction in Boston City called Winthrop Center. And its developer is Millennial Partners. So then we started this one. This is very tall, and they have ugly old buildings around. And then they are very tall. Then they have two parts. The first part, the lower part is passive house. The upper part is luxury condo. And then they chose in this way. Office, they went for passive house and all these good certificates. And the top condo, no. Why? Because they understand, they have the trade-off. So that's basically, we want to understand the developers trade-off, how to understand this. So basically, comparative advantage. For the luxury housing, luxury condos, the rich people, and they really value the view. They can see the Charles River, the ocean, or a beautiful view. So they really need huge windows. Too hard to do passive house, too hard. It costs too high. And with a view, actually, they already get the willingness to pay for the buyers to pay, and they don't need to use that as a selling point. But for the lower part, office, they have ugly neighbors. They have ugly neighbors as the old buildings, no view at all. So they say, okay, we need to frame this as the sustainability is more, have a comparative advantage. And also they don't care about small windows. So they went for passive house. So then you can see this clearly this rational choice. And then they have some estimates about this. So interestingly, we cannot look at this a static way, but a dynamic way. So the cost, when they were planning, 3 to 10% of the cost premium, because the engineers, the designers, they were not familiar with this technology. They went to Germany to learn. But then when they implement, they got new knowledge and it's become more familiar, then significantly reduced to 1 to 3%, which is good for them. And when they made the decision, the COVID is before COVID. It's not so focused on indoor air quality, but suddenly, COVID, and then the indoor quality became so important, and then they just got this benefit of this because this also indoor quality become a very big advantage of this passive house. So that's basically, they say, okay, cost went down and benefit went up. We made a so smart decision. So that's for this example, but they will also feel very fortunate they didn't choose that for the condo, for the luxury condo. But at that time, when they made decision, they forgot one thing, or they didn't consider one thing. The other thing is this electrification. So that's a second technology I want to discuss a little bit more. So electrification is the only pathway if you want to get net zero, depending on your grid. Electricity grid is already net zero, all renewable. But suppose the grid, because as a developer, as the owner of the building, you cannot control the grid. But given that grid is that, so we need to do this, electrification. So for the cooling side, always you have AC is already electricity-based. But for the heating, need to change from gas, these water boilers to this heat pump. So the heat pump technology, that also can be applied not just for heat. I just want to highlight it's not just for heating, but also for cooling, and it's better for window AC. It can provide the same effectiveness, but also to reduce the energy consumption and make indoor air quality better than the window AC. So they have heating cycle and the cooling cycle in different ways, and we are more familiar with the heating part. So that even you go to very hot places, it's also good. It's also a better option to switch to this from the window AC. But as you know, it depends on the grid decarbonization speed. You cannot just assume the grid is clean. So the grid first need to go green. And then if you use all electricity, then you become net zero. But not just the technology itself, not just the grid, but also the cultural and the social behaviors. Here I show the energy consumption per capita, especially we have some comparisons of the US so high, and for China and other countries with very high density and small houses, and also like very luxury living conditions, it's much lower. So it's not just you just do the technology, you find you are still consuming a lot. And then plus that, on top of that, we have this natural gas and the price things, the price, future price uncertainties, especially, for example, last year the gas price went up so much, so the price difference between electricity and gas also will influence the decision making. Another uncertainty is always cities will say they will decarbonize the grid in 10 years, in 20 years. They also pledged that, but due to the local physical capacity constraint, sometimes they got delayed. So under all those conditions and uncertainties, how to understand adoption of the decarbonization technologies. So that's a very simple cash flow conceptual model, but the point is all those are uncertain, and especially when another thing is for this heat pump, they will occupy more space. So the developer or the owner will lose leasable space because they need to put this equipment, which are huge, and then lose office space and lose rental revenue. But later, maybe the technology will improve, then will become smaller and smaller. So given all the uncertainty on the technology and on the gas price and the city grid decarbonization and also market preference for this all electricity building, then to understand that it's basically the owners and developers, they totally in a dark room how and when to deep retrofit their building or to build a fully electrified building or still a gas building and wait. So sometimes wait will have the real option value until the city is clear about their policy and then they implement. So basically I show some literature here, means the intersection of the technological, for example, my colleagues at the building technology, they have this building energy modeling, very detailed, without considering behavioral. And we need behavioral to understand the energy efficiency gap. And we have the financial to understand the financial side and benefit cost analysis and how to get this as a business case. That's why we have this paper, but I'm going to skip the point of the paper, but the point is we have several options, and we analyze under future uncertainties which one is better than we do this Monte Carlo simulation for now, but later we want to have more behavioral piece get into these predictions of future uncertainties, and the best of choice is always to wait. Now we have the facade, okay, we have this space there, but first we use space for normal renting. And after a few years, we get more information, and then we switch from gas to electricity. That's always have the real option value that can help. Finally, the point is, it's no free lunch. Now it's a big debate that this net zero policy will add on the cost of the construction and will be transferred, will be passed on to renters and home buyers, and will hurt the housing affordability. Because in those places already very, very expensive. Then we understand the housing affordability. This net zero housing good in terms of the energy bill may go down, but monthly payment may go up because of the rising price and rent. And which one will dominate, that will be different, totally heterogeneous across different income groups, sub-markets, and housing types, and the demand-supply elasticities. So that's why we did this local study with the Massachusetts Association of Home Builders, because they really want to get some policy incentives. They don't want the state governor just to press them to do so. They want to get some carrots instead of just the sticks. They want some carrots. Then we did some evaluation to see for different income groups. We started the utility bill, we started their price and the rent, then we understood for which income group more sensitive. And but the key thing is how to design these policy incentives so that the developers and they have the strong incentive to do so. Otherwise, they will be pushing back, and then they will reduce housing supply. That will be a disaster for the housing affordability. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll do the bios for the rest of the panel so that we can go right through, maybe while Matt is setting up. Our next speaker will be Professor Matt Turner, who's a professor of economics at Brown University, where he focuses on environmental and urban policy with recent research focus on economics of land use and transportation. Following him, we will have Nate Baum-Snow, who is a professor of economic analysis and policy at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, where his interests lie in urban real estate economics, labor economics, and economic geography. And then we have the pleasure of having a discussant, Dr. Paolo Avner, who's a senior economist here at the bank in the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, where his current work focuses on the links between urban form, land use, urban transport, labor markets, and vulnerability to natural hazards. So we'll start, each of the speakers, the two speakers have 20 minutes. So Matt.
Thank you all for staying to the end of the day, and to the organizers for inviting me to talk. This is joint with Lorenzo Aldeco, Lint Barrage, and me. So equilibrium particulate exposure. So this project came from me sort of thinking about regulating. So I've been asking myself, why am I on the program? So here's the best I've been able to do. This paper has cities in it, it has migration, and it has pollution. All right, so I think I'm hitting 2 for 3. So this paper came about as I was thinking about the following problem. Suppose you regulate a smokestack, right? We all care about pollution. We want to regulate a smokestack, right? Well, we're interested in regulating the particulates coming out of a smokestack. That's going to have a bunch of effects. One is the direct effect that we're usually interested in is going to reduce the emissions from the smokestack. But the other thing it's going to do is going to make whatever activity that smokestack is part of more difficult, right? And we can expect a lot of adjustments to that. So if you make pollution from a smokestack sufficiently difficult, close it down, what happens to all those people? Maybe they just go live next to another one. Right? And in that way, you're regulating emissions very stringently and having very little effect on people's exposure because these general equilibrium adjustments undo that. Right? And so I started reading the literature to find out if I should bother thinking about these kinds of things, and I found that all of these kinds of complex but intuitive adjustments, there is evidence for them. So the Clean Air Act, the Clean Air Act is a big US policy which has been very intensively studied. It does what it's supposed to. It reduces pollution in regulated areas. It increases house prices, probably because people want to live in cleaner areas. People are moving in, right? Pushes employment around in locations and sectors, and causes the firms to move around too. So all of these adjustments that you're thinking about, they happen, right? So as I think about that, now I want to think about how to regulate equilibrium exposure. How do I think about equilibrium exposure when maybe if I'm regulating agricultural burning, all I'm going to do is I will clean up the countryside, but I will push all those farmers into the dirtier cities. And so I wanted to be able to think about that problem. So the first step on that is, took me a while to come to, is that when we're thinking about reducing pollution, we are thinking about emissions. Right? And when we're thinking about damages, we're thinking about exposure. And the units that you use to measure those things, like the underlying particles are the same, but the units used to measure them are very different. So to be clear, right, when we're regulating emissions, we're regulating mass. We're regulating the mass of stuff coming out of smokestacks. When we are measuring concentration, like that's mass per unit volume, that's when you think about air quality. What we really care about is exposure, which is going to be some concentration coinciding with people, so people breathing dirty air. Right? And for us, that's just going to be number of people times their exposure, times the ambient exposure that they got, right? And you can go back and forth between all these things. For us, a concentration is going to be not measured in milligrams per meter cubed as usual. It will be aerosol optical depth, which is a remotely sensed version of the same thing. Okay, so what are we going to do here? We're going to get some data for the whole world and describe concentration, right, and changes in concentration. We will describe some correlations between concentration and between exposure and economic activity. And then we're going to think about what we'd like then to do is say if we see a correlation between coal consumption and exposure, like the number of people exposed to bad air, right? How do we think about whether there's a causal relationship? That's the thing we care about for policy. And there's two ways to tackle that. One is with applied micro. You'd be clever and find some research design to let you do that. And I wasn't clever enough to crack that, and so we built a model, right? And so the model is going to keep track of energy by sector and the way that the resulting emissions translate into concentration and then exposure in a way that sort of summarizes what we think we know about that process and lets us do the policy experiments that we'd like to do. Okay, so a lot of the big patterns in the data you can see in the following three figures. Okay, so this is China, India, Russia, all right? And this is population from gridded population of the world, and you see, unsurprisingly, that there are a lot of people in northern India and eastern China and not very many in Russia. So the blue dots are people. Okay, so this is the remotely sensed pollution measure, right? And no surprises here, really, right? Northern India is polluted, northeastern China is polluted, and Russia is not polluted, all right? So these are the two things that you need to think about exposure, people and air quality. Right? So if we put these two pictures on top of each other, right, we'll be able to see exposure. All right? And that's what this figure is. In this figure, high pollution and high population density is purple, right? Red is pollution but no people. Blue is people but no pollution. Right? So looking at this, you see the three of the big patterns that we see in the data. The first is if all you cared about was your pollution exposure, and I was going to turn you into a dart and throw you, you were guaranteed you were going to hit a blue dot in China, India, or Russia, and all you care about is your pollution exposure, that's easy, right? You want to be in Russia. Okay? If you start thinking about the difference between India and China, it's a little tougher, all right? And you will notice, so the first fact is that pollution exposure is a country-specific thing. You understand a lot of variation in exposure as soon as you know the country somebody is in, right? The second thing is that if you look carefully at India and China, you will see that the geography of pollution is quite different. And you see that in China, you have this sort of, the areas around the blue, or around the purple or pink, right? Which is to say that the Chinese have concentrated all their people in the most polluted places, and you can't escape by going to the edge of the city. It's still dirty. India has the opposite pattern. They've concentrated a lot of people into dirty places, but as you go out, you get blue rather than red, so that you can escape pollution in Indian cities by going to the edges of them. And so something about the economic geography of pollution in these two places is different. Okay, that's the second big fact that comes out of the data. All right, the first is countries really matter. And the second is it looks like the economic geography matters. That's consistent with what we saw in the literature, which is that the economic geography of pollution exposure is complicated. Okay. This table tells about the same story as those two figures, and since I'm trying to get through this in 20 minutes, I won't talk about it. Now, the other thing that is interesting to think about is what are the sources of pollution, right? And this table basically gives you a global accounting of particulates, right? So the units here, so this is, and sorry you guys, if you want to turn around, you can't see my pointer if you're looking at that screen. So world average, area weighted average is 23. So that's the 23 parts per million of ambient particulates. Okay, if we take all the coal that's burned in the world, right, we know the fraction of that coal that ends up in the atmosphere, all right? That's a certain amount of mass. If we divide that into the volume of air into which it's released, which is basically the volume of air over the inhabited places, okay, the volume of the concentration of particulates released into the air every year is 958, which is to say that about 50 times as much particulates goes into the air from coal smoke alone as is in the air on an average day. Right, so coal smoke's cycling through the atmosphere pretty rapidly. Okay, these numbers are also all similar. The units are the same. We do the same thing for oil, agricultural burning. Here, because we have such amazing data, we can calculate flows across international boundaries in and out. Right, so we can calculate flows in and flows out. And what we see is that, relative to the ambient, right, the flows in and out of the atmosphere are enormous, and of the possible flows in and out of the atmosphere, the natural suspects are exactly what you expect, right? Coal is the big one. Oil, agricultural burning, flows in and flow out are all important, right? These others are service processes, is basically transportation. Industrial process is industrial processes not related to burning things. All right, now, so we know what's going in, all right? We can guess from physicists, from what we know of physics, how fast this stuff falls out of the atmosphere. Right? It falls out at a certain rate. And the model for particulates falling out of the atmosphere are like the model for blowing across a border. Right? You know how to calculate particulates blowing across the border. You calculate deposition in exactly the same way, except for in place of wind, you have gravity. So if you know the rate at which things are settling, which we do from natural scientists, then you can think about deposition, right? That's what this is. So this is the magnitude of deposition from in a typical year in a typical 10 kilometer grid cell, right? And then the natural source is also large. So what this says is conditional on us having got the deposition rate, right? This is the amount of natural particulates that we need in order to balance the books. Okay? And what we see here is that number is really big. So what this suggests is if we have this is a model-based conclusion. If we have the deposition rate correct, then coal and oil and ag burning and flow in and flow out are the most important anthropogenic sources, but they are small next to natural sources of particulates. Okay. So what we next want to do is try to understand. So I've sort of told you the big patterns in the data. I've showed you the likely suspects for causes of pollution. I'm going to try to confirm that with regression analysis. And I'm going to find something which I think is consistent with those figures, but that I nevertheless find surprising. Okay. We're going to do a regression. Our data is organized around 10 kilometer square cells. All right, it's the native resolution of gridded population of the world. Right, and so we have for each of the 4 years of data that we have, we will regress cell concentration on country level indicator variables or country year level indicators. If we do that, we get an R squared of 50. Okay, which is just what I showed you in those pictures. If I know the country that you're in, I can reduce my prediction error for your exposure by 50%. All right. If I try to partition that country-specific variable, if I try to break that down into country-specific variables, I can explain almost all of that 50% with oil consumption, coal consumption, ag burning, flows in and flows out. So those things together let me explain almost half of all the variation in concentration at the country level. Okay. More surprising is that 50% that's unexplained, I cannot explain with pixel level variation in landscape or population density or weather. Okay. So basically that's just random, right? That's pretty surprising, or at least was to me, but practically adding those variables changes my ability to predict exposure by a very, very small amount. Okay, so that's the main features of the data. What I would now like to be able to do is I would like to be able to evaluate policies to restrict coal, for example. Okay, I can't do that because I don't think that changes in coal use are, I don't think I'm estimating causal coefficients. So we're going to try to do that with a model instead. Here are the basic features of that model. All right. We're gonna not worry about the interactions between countries. It's going to be a model of a country, which we will estimate for the 31 countries that we can get data for. The countries won't interact. So each country is going to be small, open, static. All right. We're not going to worry about adjustment processes of pollution because we know that pollution is cycling through the atmosphere very fast compared to the stock. All right. We're going to think of we're going to think about 4 sectors of production. There's going to be industry in the countryside, industry in the urban areas. We'll break each country into 2 areas, urban and rural. There's industry in the country, industry in the city, services in the city, and agriculture in the country. And each of those 4 activities will have its own energy production function, so which is going to mean that farmers can have a different mix of coal, oil, and gas than service workers in the city, for example. And that's going to turn out to be important. Okay. We're going to let people move back and forth to equalize the marginal product of their labor. We're going to have capital you get from outside the country at a fixed cost. You buy all your fuel outside the country at a fixed cost. And then we're going to get data that describes the relationship between how much fuel you use, how much particulates go in the air, right? And marry this whole setup, which is so far this is easy, right? I've got small country, 2 regions, 2 activities in each region. People can move around. There's capital and there's energy. Okay, we want to match that. So to study exposure, I need to match that to a description of how particulates move around in the atmosphere. Okay, so we're going to match this to a model that describes particulates moving around. That will give us an integrated assessment model for particulates. Okay, so the model for how particulates move around is the simplest one that will suit. Okay, and it is what is called a 2-box model. Right, the way the box models work is to understand a 1-box model. Imagine that you have a cube in front of you, and you're going to pour some particulates into it. As soon as they get into your box, they're completely dispersed. Once they are in your box, they start falling out of the box at a constant rate as gravity is pulling them down, right? So that the amount of particulates that deposit out of the air in that box is proportional to the concentration. Okay? So I'm going to keep pouring this stuff in. Eventually, I'll hit a steady state where I'm pouring things in at the same rate as they are falling out by deposition. That's going to be my steady state. I'm going to use exactly that model to think about how particulates move around. The sources are going to be all the sources of burning that I've just described, okay? Except for I'm going to link 2 of these boxes, right, so that particulates can flow from one to the other, right? One of those boxes is going to be urban and one is going to be rural, right? Which is going to depend on the country, because in some places we'll have pollution flowing from the urban area to the countryside and some conversely. So there's really 2 distinct models. Okay, so that's going to be the setup, and then the trick is to try to fit that to the world in a way that you might maybe believe a little bit. Once we've done that, we can do policy experiments on, for example, taxing coal. Okay, and so this is just a description of equilibrium in this model. We need everybody to maximize. We need all the usual things, all right? We need all the usual things. There's no trick here. Okay, and the big contribution here, apart from, so I think that sort of putting an economic model together with a pollution dispersion model is novel, is getting all of the data out of the literature for all of the various parameters that we need in the energy production functions and the various elasticities, some of which we have to estimate. Okay, so once we have that all put together, we can evaluate counterfactual policies, right? And if we do that, we find all kinds of funny things. All right, and so I've only got a few minutes, so let me just tell you about one of them. Yes. So let's think about an oil tax, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to consider a tax on oil. This is a histogram of the change in exposure, concentration times people, where each of the bumps in that histogram is a country. So we do this for 31 countries. And you see that taxing oil in most countries increases exposure. How can that be? Okay. All right. What happens is the agricultural sector is disproportionately dependent on oil. So when you start taxing oil, it's like taxing agriculture, right? Make it harder for farmers. What do? They go do something worse. Okay, so they either go move to the city or they go into rural industry, which is dirtier. In either case, that tax, which reduces pollution in the polluting act, it reduces activity in the particular sector you're targeting, ends up increasing concentration because of the general equilibrium effects, right? You see the same thing. The coal tax works better, right? You occasionally get these positive effects on exposure, but rarely. Anyways, so the short story of this is that the short version of this is that we want to think about equilibrium responses to regulation, equilibrium particulate exposure, right? There's some striking facts about that in the world. Your country's really important. The economic geography of pollution is really important. And all those general equilibrium effects that you worry about when you are thinking about pollution they're out there, right? And we have constructed a model to assess their importance as best we can. And that model suggests that they are of first order importance, so much so that they can cause regulation, which you might expect to be beneficial for exposure to, in fact, be harmful. And that's all I've got. I'm 20 seconds ahead. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for sticking to the time. Next, we have Nate Baum-Snow, who's going to talk about the global effects of the skyscraper revolution, presenting another study using the same data set that we had a paper on in the last panel. Okay, 20 minutes.
Ready to
Start.
go. Great. So thanks so much for having me here. I hope to keep it somewhat brief so that we can get to cocktails later. I know everyone's looking forward to that. So this is joint with Remy, who's right here, who we heard from earlier, also about skyscrapers, and Gabriel Alfelt. And what we want to think about here in this paper is the extent to which skyscrapers facilitate the accommodation of greater population in cities and land savings in cities. And so this is a picture of Sao Paulo right here. Lots of skyscrapers, lots of people living in those skyscrapers. It's intuitive to think about the fact that, hey, maybe this is a way of allowing cities to be more climate friendly by having smaller footprints. Okay? So as we saw earlier from Remy's paper, there's been an exponential growth in the heights of skyscrapers worldwide, and a lot of this is in the developing world. And there's a lot of variation across cities in how much skyscrapers have been built. Okay? The other thing that's really important about this is that actually most of the skyscraper construction has been for residential use, and that's going to kind of come up in our analysis a little bit later. Okay. Skyscrapers are also, we're going to show, central drivers of urban structure. They're going to have effects on population and on the amount of land used in urban space. And in this study, what we're really kind of thinking about is extending the literature on infrastructure. So there's a lot of work, some of which I've done myself, some of which Matt's done, on the effects of transport infrastructure in cities. This is another sort of infrastructure, kind of vertical infrastructure, that we think should have impacts as well. And so we want to investigate empirically and conceptually what those impacts are. It's difficult from an identification perspective because skyscrapers are built by private developers that are responding to standard cost factors and demand conditions. And so I think perhaps there's a more difficult identification challenge here when it comes to doing the empirical work. Okay. So the data, I'll be brief because we saw a lot of that in Remy's presentation, but we basically have data on 13,000 cities worldwide, global human settlements data. and Emporis data on skyscrapers, basically the universe of skyscrapers and tall buildings over 55 meters. The key identification idea here is going to be to think about depth of bedrock and to recognize that if bedrock is too close to the surface, it's costly to build tall buildings on it because it must be blasted away. But if bedrock is too deep, it's also costly to build tall buildings on it because it requires building the foundation deeper to reach the bedrock or having more complicated and costly engineering with a foundation that's not pinned to the bedrock. Okay, so that's going to be the idea. I'll get into that a little bit more as I get into details. And I'm going to show you height elasticities of about 12% for population and about minus 17% for built area in the city. And that's driven by cities in developing economies. Okay? So at the very end, I'll talk briefly about a model, but I probably won't have time to do that. But I think there is a role here for thinking kind of generally about what's possible. We contribute to a number of literatures here, and I'll just skip over that and tell you a little bit more about the data. We've got global human settlements data. We've got city-level outcomes. We're going to be focusing on the period 1975 to 2015. And we've got some lights data, and we've got some land use data that we can see what type of uses, in particular agricultural uses and forest cover uses land is in, and we can see then as a result what types of land is being saved by the tall buildings that are built in cities. And so the main kind of predicting variable of interest is going to be the amount of height, the aggregate amount of height in a city in a year when you add up all the tall buildings in that city, all the buildings over 55 meters. So here's the Emporis data. Here is all the tall buildings in the world. And here's Dubai. And here is the growth of aggregate heights worldwide, really exponential growth since the 1970s. And that kind of justifies our beginning year of 1975 for this study. And it's about 11,500 kilometers of new heights built. As I said, most of this is residential. Okay, and here we see the stocks in 1975, and that a lot of this growth is in Latin America and Asia, in particular, and some in the Middle East. Okay, so these are the types of buildings we're thinking about for this study. You might think about kind of the Burj Khalifa or these signature towers around the world. That's not the typical tall building that has been built around the world since 1975. We're thinking more, and if you look at the data, it's more likely to be kind of utilitarian concrete structures, some of which you see examples of in this picture from Nairobi, Kenya. And these are the sorts of buildings, that can house thousands of people, and will show that they do house millions of people around the world, even in developing economy cities. Okay, so this is just showing you some summary statistics, breaking out the distribution of population across cities in 1975 into three groups, into terciles. And it's to show that most of the height growth is in these very big cities, as you can imagine, okay? Even though the population growth is actually the highest, has the highest rates in these very small cities. I'm going to show you some sort of a counterfactual later, and that's going to come up. I'll mention that again, okay? But we've seen an enormous amount of height growth in percentage terms in these in the largest tercile of cities. That's going to reflect demand conditions, growth in demand for height that we're going to use and have to take account of in our empirical strategy. Okay. So this idea of using bedrock depth, I mentioned it before. Basically, as you build taller, buildings get heavier and you got to have a deeper foundation. Okay, so the optimal bedrock depth is going to depend on the height of the building, and having the bedrock be too deep is going to be more costly. Having the bedrock be too close to the surface is also going to be more costly. That is, the cost function for height, for building height, is non-monotonic in bedrock depth. And we took some data from Emporis and kind of residualized out what we think would be kind of input cost factors for buildings, and took the log cost per square foot in the building and just residualized for city fixed effects and country decade fixed effects, and just graphed a contour plot like this. And so what you see is, for a building of 125 meters tall, the cost minimizing bedrock depth is about 17 meters. For a building that's 200 meters tall, the cost minimizing bedrock depth is about 25 meters. And you see, for a given height, quite a bit of variation that can be up to about 10 to 15% of the cost per square foot. So this is the sort of variation that we're going to try to use in our empirics to get at variation in height growth across cities. Okay? So that's going to come down to kind of looking at regressions like this to start to see the extent to which the relationship between population in 1975 and construction depends on the depth of the bedrock. So the idea is the following. Bigger cities had higher demand growth for height. And so if we compare big cities with different bedrock depths, we should see different responses in the amount of height that's built. And we should see different relationships between city size and height at different bedrock depths. Okay? So when we run this regression, I'm going to show you these gamma B coefficients here. This is going to be the dependent variable for regressions is going to be the amount of tall building construction, the number of tall buildings built in percentage terms. Each bubble is a coefficient, and what you see is that the most height growth, the strongest height relationship with population is at bedrock depths of about 20 meters or so. Okay? And each bubble, the size of each bubble reflects the number of cities in that sample. And so you see a lot of data here in this range of bedrock depths, and you see this non-monotonic relationship between height growth and population as a function of bedrock depth. That's what we're going to be using for identification here. You see a very similar picture when you use just the total growth in heights, not the number of tall buildings built. Okay. You can fit a curve to this. The best curve is kind of like sort of flexible polynomial. But if you fit a quadratic, it turns out to give very similar results. And that's what we're going to use just to be kind of more transparent about what we're doing. But both of them are going to give very similar results. Okay, so this suggests an IV strategy for height. Okay. We're going to need to hold trends in demand for cities constant. So we're going to need to control for population, the level of population, and because we want to know how new heights affect how many people live in the city. Okay? And we're also going to want to control for bedrock depth. Okay? So we can imagine an estimation equation like this, where we try to predict in a sort of a first stage the amount of height growth with some interaction between bedrock depth and initial population, controlling for those two things, and we're going to have country fixing effects in there as well, and this is looking over time, so this implicitly has city fixed effects as well. Okay, so you should think of the identifying variation here as kind of having a difference in difference flavor. We're going to be looking at high versus low initial population and sort of medium depth versus low or high depth bedrock. Okay? And we want to think about the extent to which bedrock affects larger cities over time. Okay, so this is just laying out the first stage, and we get a strong enough first stage here. And then we can go to the second stage and look at outcomes, be they population, built-up area, population density, and I'm gonna decompose built-up area a little bit in a second, okay? Where we instrument for the growth in heights at the city level with essentially an interaction between population and bedrock depth. Okay, and so that's there. And we can use more flexible functional forms when we do this, and when we instrument, we're going to get very similar results. Okay. So these are kind of the main results that I want to point to, and then I'm going to decompose them and talk about implications. Okay, so in particular, we get an elasticity of population or population growth with respect to height growth of 0.12. That is, if a city's amount of heights grows by 10%, its population is predicted to grow by 1.2%. And for built area, minus 0.17. Okay, so it does indeed look like these tall buildings are accommodating more people in the cities and saving more land in the cities. And we can do similar or analogous regressions with radiance calibrated lights and get similar results. Okay, so where is this land that's saved coming from? This is a picture of Sao Paulo again, and this is cropland degradation that's occurred since 1982. And so here, what we can do is we can first weight by agricultural suitability of the land. We get very similar estimates, but the average fraction of land that's agriculturally suitable is 56%. So, so you kind of get a sense of the percent of the total city area that's saved due to the tall buildings, because that is agriculturally suitable is about 9% if you kind of do the calculation. Tree cover has a much bigger elasticity of minus 0.22, but it's also a relatively small fraction of the initial land area. So, but what you can say is, hey, it's not that much when you kind of do the multiplication there, but the marginal land that seems to be saved by tall buildings, at a very high rate, it seems to be forested land, that tree canopy, okay? And then short vegetation is a little bit smaller when you add it up than tree cover, and cropland is a bit smaller still. Okay, so these are the sources of land savings. We also looked at different subsamples, and in the developing world, basically the estimates are pretty stable. We didn't have the statistical power to kind of go continent by continent, but we left one out one by one, and you get very similar estimates. For the developed world, most of the effect is driven by the US and Canada. The rest of the developed world, we're basically getting zeros here. We also looked by the fraction of buildings in the country that, tall buildings that are in residential use. And so as you go to the right on this graph, the country has higher residential share in tall buildings. And what you get there is much bigger land savings effects in particular, like over double at, say, 80% relative to 50% residential. And so it looks like, building these residential towers is really helping in saving land. You see a little bit more on the population margin in the developing economies, but really most of the difference is on the land margin here. Okay, and then we looked by population, initial population of the city, and this is just saying that for the smaller cities, you tend to get somewhat bigger estimates. And the reason we did this, and this is the F statistic, so the first stage is strong throughout. The reason we did this was we wanted to ask, hey, for all the tall buildings that were built since 1975, how many people have been accommodated because of them, and how much land has been saved? And so we thought in doing that, we wanted to have estimates that were flexible by city size, so we weren't applying kind of an average effect to really large cities that built a lot of tall buildings. Okay. I can say, we did a bunch of robustness checks. I don't think I have time to go into those details, but we thought a lot about the things that could be correlated with bedrock depth and the things that could be correlated with that interacted with 1975 population, and we really found quite robust results there. Okay, so in terms of this impacts of the construction that happened since 1975, here are the numbers. Overall, if you kind of plug in our estimates from those graphs just before, you get for the developing world about 232 million people accommodated in cities because of the tall buildings that have been built. That's about 8% of the population in 2015 of those buildings. And then sort of analogous, slightly larger numbers for area land savings because of these tall buildings, okay? So in particular, 14% of the current built-up area, or 2015 built-up area, because of these tall buildings, okay? So I have 1 minute, I think, so I'm not going to talk about modeling, but we also have a modeling component here, which has some elements of the model that Harris presented, but is a lot simpler because we wanted to be able to apply it to many cities around the world simultaneously. So it's going to have residents, construction sector, and production, and it's going to have a land market that clears. And in particular, we did this because we wanted to have kind of two types of exercises to help us think about the extent to which tall buildings can improve welfare. The first is to compute the aggregate effects of height given no constraints and given a height limit of 55 meters, which are buildings below which we would see in our data. And comparing those two, you get a welfare gain of about 3% for workers and about 1.5% overall, because landowners are worse off because basically you're making a bunch of land that would have been built on agricultural instead. The second exercise is to compute the aggregate effect of removing all current skyscrapers, and you get about a third of those magnitudes coming out. And so what the implication is that, this is pretty rough, but it seems like something like a third of the welfare potential of tall buildings has been realized through what's been built. Today, presumably a lot of construction has not happened because of land use restrictions and various restrictions that governments put on building. So in conclusion, we think the skyscraper revolution's been important for cities. Tall buildings are important, and they've allowed cities to accommodate a lot of people and resulted in a large amount of land savings. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you very much, Nate. And next we'll have our discussant, Paolo, who has 20 minutes as well.
No, I think I've got a little less. Sorry, where am I?
The last discussion.
Okay, got you. Thanks. So, hi everyone. I'll try not to be too long because I know this is the end of the day. Thank you so much for inviting me, Remy, Harris. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll get right into it. First of all, it was a real pleasure to read these papers. They're two excellent papers. Well, one of them is a PowerPoint for now, but it will be an excellent paper. In both of them, impressive data collection, interpretation efforts, and statistical treatment, both in a very own way. The panel data on the particulate concentration, transport as well as country and high resolution indicator. On one hand, the global data based on tall buildings, I can see there's already two papers based on this, and I can imagine that this could have quite a following and quite a convincing instrumental strategy. Two robust modeling frameworks. I know Nate didn't actually discuss the modeling much, but I think it has a lot of potential too in a very much simpler way, but a very kind of schematic way. But I think there are lots of lessons that can be gained for that. And the paper by Matt really has a very sophisticated integrated assessment or augmented integrated assessment model that I think can be used to look into very many questions in the future. So this is clearly only the beginning of it. Both of these have key building blocks to look into climate change mitigation strategies. The elephant in the room is that neither of them actually looks at climate change mitigation strategies, right? Let me say that. But they do have the building blocks to do that. The paper by Matt looking at mitigating air pollution. We know that one of the key co-benefits of CO2 emission mitigation efforts is basically reducing pollution and the negative health impacts from them. The second paper has looking at the potential benefits from tall buildings in terms of densification and intensive land use in cities is kind of only one step removed from looking at actually energy implication, energy consumption implications, commuting implications. So both are 1 or 2 steps short of discussing climate change mitigations, but these are a really important paper and stepping stones to do that in the future. And the comparisons kind of stop there because both of them are very, very different. So I'm not going to go the more elegant way of trying to discuss both of them at the same time. I will discuss them successively. So the first paper by Matt, actually, you saw the map that Matt showed on the left there, which is the exposure to particulate emissions. Actually reminded me of a paper from my very good colleague Jun Rentschler, who's here at the bank, that looked at the population exposure specifically to PM 2.5. And you're seeing similar trends, but you also see, if you squint and if you look a bit, it seems to be slightly different. In Matt's paper, like China was worse off in terms of exposure because there was a coincidence of population and concentrations of particulates, whilst we seem to see the opposite in India. So this is, it's totally possible that this is just a visual artifact, and it's just how the population was aggregated by administrative area, what we're seeing. I think in Matt's paper we see, we don't actually see an aggregation, we only see the population at the spatial 10-kilometer square grid, I think. So, but it did get me thinking. Are we talking about the same thing? I think that June's paper is looking at PM 2.5, whilst Matt's paper, maybe you can confirm, is looking at particulates in general, right? So it's right. So I was actually thinking, is it possible that we could see different patterns if we're looking at all the particulates, or if we're only looking at the PM 2.5? And if that's the case, and you're nodding, so I imagine that is the case, which would be the most meaningful if we're thinking about health? Is it kind of all of them at the same time, or is it 2.5? So I was wondering, because I also imagine in that case, you could have very different policy implications, right? If you're focusing on particulates in general, and they have very different spatial patterns in terms of exposure, than the PM 2.5. So just some food for thought. Maybe you want to come back to that. A next comment was trying to bring this paper, closer to the actual theme of the session, which is climate change mitigation. So of course, studying particulates pollution is important in its own right? I mean, I think there was the keynote actually today said that was the most urgent problem because it's just killing so many people every year. So it's super important in its own right, but it's also possibly a good entry point to be speaking about climate change mitigation strategies. As I said this before, we often discuss, health co-benefits from climate change mitigation strategies as basically the biggest win. But I can see, two difficulties in trying to do this with the model that Matt showed. First is that natural gas, as I understood, was actually listed among the sources that did not contribute any particulates. So obviously, and it does contribute to CO2 emissions. I mean, much less than coal for sure, but it does. So that's probably one of the difficulties. And I also saw that the wood burning, would actually be considered possibly as a no or low emitting, a fuel if you're thinking about CO2 emissions, but is high in terms of particulates. So basically, two questions from this. Can the model actually be tailored to go one step further? I don't know if you want to do that, because there's a lot to do with, particulate emission, but I wondered if it could be pushed forward to do that. And if you'd thought a little bit about those potential trade-offs between the goal of reducing pollution and the negative health impacts, and trying to curb CO2 emissions. So that was one. I mean, there are probably a lot of synergies, but there might be some trade-offs there too. And I wonder in which proportion, and if you've given that any thought. A few additional thoughts on this paper, and you do mention it, so I shouldn't. You do actually mention this in the paper. The first question is it really average concentrations that matter, or is it spikes in pollution? And I wasn't quite clear which one it is. Clearly in the paper you're looking at annual average concentrations. And I imagine that this would also have important policy implications. It seems that if spikes is what is calling the real or the bunch of the negative health impacts, then a focus on smoothing without actually making a dent necessarily in the annual concentrations, just smoothing them over time would be a good strategy. So just wanted to get your thoughts on that too. And the last question on whether you have any thoughts about, so you put together these really nice counterfactuals about what policies could be implemented and what would the consequences be in terms of where people locate in the two urban and rural economy, but also what the welfare and the exposure consequences are. Wonder if you've given any thoughts to the political economy implications, right? Are there any of those three policies that you discussed, the oil tax, the coal tax, and the ag burning tax, which would, in your view, be less difficult or less contentious, either because it's less costly, or because it affects less people, or affects potentially people who are more dispersed or less likely to regroup and kind of contest that policy? So that was a few last questions on this. I'm trying to go through quickly. Maybe I'm going through too quickly, but I did want to go through too quickly. So let me turn now to Nate's paper. And again, fantastic paper, super thought-provoking. So this was one of the first things that I thought about is it really tall buildings, or is it floor space density, which is leading to the compactness of your urban area and the welfare gains that you quantify at the end in the modeling. And I was reminded about a few publications that I read quite a long time ago, and this is about, it actually comes out from the planning agency from Paris. And what it's showing you is that basically you can have very different types of buildings that at a certain plot of land would lead to very similar floor space densities. And in this case, you've got a very tall building in the middle of a space which is kind of empty because you've got parking lots, because you've got parks. And then you could have medium-sized buildings that would lead to the same type of floor density, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to have your thoughts on that. Also because, it kind of, it reminded me, so basically this is the Olympiade, which is a neighborhood in Paris 13th where I was brought up, and I lived about 100 meters from this place. And this is kind of illustrates a little bit what we're seeing, and it's a real world example of what we're seeing on the left, which is you do have lots of tall buildings there, and there are many more in the background that you don't see. But you've also got a lot of floor space, which is open there. Also for commercial, you can walk around, it's quite pleasant during the day at least. So that is the question. So if I summarize, is it tall buildings that enable the city compactness and the benefits that come with it, or is it simply the floor space density? And so an associated question is it tall buildings associated with no or low land use regulations like open space, parking space that would give you the benefits that you're seeing? So one of the conclusions of the paper is that you're seeing a declining height elasticity of construction costs with potential for reducing negative externalities. So sprawl, potentially CO2 emissions. I know you don't go that far, but I could see that as one potential negative externalities that you're helping. Actually, maybe I wasn't. And you're creating positive ones, right? Lower rents, higher land values. So one question I have for you is, based on this, is there a case for subsidizing tall buildings? Or conversely, for actually taxing low-density urban development? And I just wanted to mention one paper that we did a few years back with Stefan, who was also chairing the previous session, which is a paper where we were actually looking at a land tax on low density construction in Paris, and had some similar type of monocentric framework, had some kind of, seemed like the conclusions were nice, right? And the second question, if we're kind of zooming out a little bit and we're thinking of different types of policies, if you do think there's a case, for any intervention to try and, make cities more compact and etc., if you had $1 to spend, would you use it to subsidize construction, so the tall buildings, or would you use it, and this is again going back to a climate change angle, a climate change mitigation angle, or to subsidize public transport, which we assume would be either decarbonized or less carbonized than, private cars. And again, just a paper which I think, that we did a few years back, and we kind of stopped. We didn't go ahead and publish it, but was actually looking at some of these counterfactuals where we were looking at Buenos Aires. We had an applied model of Buenos Aires. They were very concerned about the amount of the public transport subsidies and that were going into the public transport system, and they wanted to understand what the implications would be of removing these, or removing them and replacing them by compensating schemes. So this is what we did, and one of the things that we did look at is, what happens if you reinvest this into kind of construction subsidies, and in some specific cases in targeted construction subsidies, which are really aiming for the city center where the buildings are already quite tall. And so you see that you do find that same effect of the average distance to the city center going down. You also see that the impact on CO2 emissions is not very high, and of course because a lot of people, because you're taxing basically public transport, are going back to cars or walking. So you're not seeing a very strong effect on the CO2 emissions. And the last thing that I wanted to point out is that if you're thinking in terms of household welfare, these construction subsidies appear to be less efficient in terms of household welfare than the public transport subsidies. And so I want to pause there, say I think you might find a different conclusion, because even your simple model you have is actually more sophisticated than what we had, because you've got amenities from views, etc., which we didn't capture. And I think that would be a nice thing to actually look at. And the reason why we found this is that basically we had an increasing, so every extra floor costs more than the previous one. Whereas, transport fares, they're just linear. So that's why, so it was easier to go one horizontally, to travel 1 extra kilometer than it was to build one story up. So just wanted to leave you with that and get your thoughts on that, and I actually encourage you to go in that direction, because I think it's quite interesting. Some last thoughts. So thinking more globally, are there any differences in the municipal costs which are associated with skyscrapers versus other types of buildings? I imagine that if you're having tall buildings and you're actually kind of managing to limit the extent of your urban area, you're probably saving on some of the linear infrastructure, so sewage, roads, all else equal. But you also have increased local costs. Maybe you have to build more parks, maybe more schools. I'm fishing a little bit here, but I wonder if you put any thoughts into this. So yes, that's it. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We've got some excellent insights and questions. I don't know if you maybe can take 2 questions, or do we just let them? Okay, actually, that's a better. So if you want to pose a question to someone, come to the reception, and you can do it one-on-one, sort of in-depth. But we will allow each of the speakers a couple of minutes, since the questions I thought were actually quite good. So, Matt, I don't know if you want to start?
I'd really just like to thank Paolo for the thoughtful comments, and I'll try to talk to him.
Nate?
Yes, so me too. Really thoughtful comments. Really appreciate the comments, and I really appreciate the fact that you were able to figure out what was in the model without us actually telling you what was in the model. So you inferred that quite nicely. Just I do think so. The model only has one source of externality, and that's production externalities. It doesn't have CO2 emissions or any of that. So that would say, yes, maybe it makes sense to limit sprawl or subsidize height a little bit in the model, but I think the model's probably better suited for doing something like saying, suppose you get rid of all land use regulations, than talking about internalizing these sorts of externalities. But great comments, and look forward to talking more at the cocktail party.
Great, let's thank our panel, and then we'll have one closing comment about how we actually get to the reception.
Right, so I have some practical information for us all. I'm the last thing in between us and the drinks, but I also have the directions for the drinks. But just before that, one final thing, some thanks. I want to thank everyone that's here for coming to participate, both like all the speakers that we have, but also the audience. It was really great to, hold this in person and be able to, meet with everyone in person. That was really, really great. But then also some specifics. There were a few people kind of behind the scenes that really made this happen that we need to thank. And this was Elaine Wiley, Ryan Han, Yahe Lee, and the rest of the team at the World Bank. And then Kyle Renner and the team at IIEP, Tom Craster, Julia Laborio, and the rest of the team at IGC. And also the people that helped review papers for the Young Urban Economist Workshop. So thank you very much. Yes, round of applause. And, right, what we're all waiting for, we're going to go to the Elliott School for this cocktail reception. It's just a few blocks down the street, but in order to keep people from getting lost, we'll all meet out at the main entrance in 8 minutes at about 5:45, and then we'll head over together. Okay? If you do get separated from the group, there's instructions on the main website page. But I look forward to seeing you all there.